I remember it started with a strange, persistent buzzing from my phone late one evening. I was sitting at our kitchen table, the overhead light casting a warm glow on the scattered receipts and half-finished grocery list I'd been ignoring for the past hour. My husband, Daniel, had just stepped into the shower upstairs. He'd had a long day at work. He always seemed to have long days lately, and I was grateful for the momentary quiet. But when I picked up my phone, I saw a notification that caught me off guard. An unknown number had sent me a private message, and the subject line simply read, "You need to know this about your husband." My heart fluttered in the kind of way that's somewhere between fear and confusion. Part of me wanted to dismiss it outright. We've all gotten suspicious texts, spam, phishing attempts. Yet something about this message felt personal. I hesitated, tapping my finger against the table's edge. Before I could think better of it, I opened the message. Inside, there was a single sentence: "Your husband is not who he says he is. Please, for your own sake, be careful." I read it over and over, searching for context, for any hint of identity. I realized I recognized a particular turn of phrase at the end. It was subtle, but I'd heard something similar many times from my old friend Tanya, someone I'd known since college. She used to say "for your own sake" whenever she tried to warn me about bad choices, bad relationships, or bad ideas. We hadn't spoken much lately, just polite exchanges online, but I still felt I knew her voice. Why would Tanya send me something like this anonymously? Why not just call me, or come by and talk in person? We lived only a few neighborhoods apart. My initial disbelief blurred into suspicion. I tried to shake off the sense of unease by reminding myself that my husband and I had been married for nearly 6 years. Daniel was stable, reliable, and never once had I caught him in a meaningful lie. He was the type to wake up early and make me coffee without being asked. He was the type to remember obscure anniversaries, like the date we first bumped into each other at the old bookstore. He'd been so attentive that it was hard to imagine him hiding something significant. And yet here I was, staring at this message and feeling a knot forming in my stomach. I tried to recall if Tanya ever mentioned something about Daniel that struck me as odd. She'd never exactly warmed up to him, but she hadn't openly disliked him either. Whenever we talked about him, she would just nod, smile thinly, and change the subject. A couple of years ago, I'd asked her directly if something bothered her about Daniel, and she'd brushed it off with a casual, "Oh, I'm sure he's fine." At the time, I thought she was just not interested in my marital life. Now I wondered if she'd been holding something back all along, something too delicate or complicated to bring out into the open. As I sat there, my gaze drifted from the phone screen to the family photos framed on the wall. Daniel and I, smiling under the sun in Greece on our honeymoon. The two of us holding his niece's tiny hands, guiding her steps. Another, with me leaning on his shoulder in front of our first house. These were images I trusted, memories that felt real. If my old friend was trying to dismantle the life I'd built with him, I needed to know why. There was a reason she chose to remain anonymous, though it was barely concealed. It must have been deliberate. A direct text from Tanya would force a confrontation, and maybe she wasn't ready for that. Maybe she was testing the waters, watching me from behind a veil. Maybe she wanted to see if I would dismiss her words or investigate further. 1,000 questions swarmed my mind, swirling around like a dark cloud. Could Daniel have a secret life I knew nothing about? Was Tanya jealous of our relationship? Was this a grudge from years past, something that had finally bubbled to the surface? My chest tightened as I thought about confrontation. I wanted to run upstairs and demand answers from Daniel, but what would I even say? "Hey, I got this weird message from someone who might be Tanya, telling me you're not who you say you are." It sounded absurd, yet the message wouldn't let me rest. I knew I had to figure out what Tanya meant before letting my suspicions harm my marriage. As I stood up, feeling the need to move, to do something, I heard the shower upstairs turn off. I looked at my phone again, reading the message for the 10th time. With a deep breath, I decided that I wouldn't mention anything to Daniel just yet. Not until I had more information. But how would I get it? Tanya's silence, her decision to remain anonymous, told me I might not find the answer easily. I'd have to be subtle. I'd have to listen more closely to the stories my husband told me about his day, watch for inconsistencies, changes in his tone or schedule. I'd have to reach out to Tanya somehow, without scaring her off. I would have to play detective in my own marriage. I slipped my phone into my pocket and headed upstairs, my mind churning with possibilities. All the while, a strange tension coiled in my stomach. As I climbed, I could hear Daniel humming softly, probably drying off, completely unaware of the tempest brewing inside me. The next few days, I realized, would test the trust I'd always cherished and force me to uncover the truth, whatever it might be. Over the next few days, I tried to keep my emotions hidden. I pretended nothing was wrong, smiling when Daniel asked how my day was, nodding at his stories about deadlines at work. I still woke up early to find that he had made my coffee just the way I liked it, still saw him fold my sweater and place it carefully on the dresser. Everything he did seemed so normal, so right. But under my calm surface, questions circled like sharks. I needed to confirm that Tanya was behind the anonymous warning. I decided to reach out to her, but carefully. If I confronted her, she might deny everything, and I'd lose my only lead. If I was too subtle, though, she might slip away. After some thought, I sent her a brief text. Hey, it's been a while. How are you? Harmless, casual, something an old friend might send after too long without contact. She replied a few hours later with a quick, friendly note. I'm good. How's life? I sensed nothing strange in her words, no hint of the tension she'd dropped into my world. It was frustrating, but I tried another angle, asking if she remembered the bookstore where Daniel and I first met, an inside reference to see if she'd take the bait. She answered without hesitation, recalling a detail from that afternoon, but didn't offer anything that might reveal her hand. Late one evening, I decided to study my husband's behavior more closely. He'd fallen asleep on the couch while we watched an old movie. His head tilted back, mouth slightly open, one arm draped over his stomach. As I slipped away to our bedroom, I noticed his phone resting on the coffee table. We had never snooped in each other's devices before, but tonight I hovered over it. I felt like an intruder in my own home. After a moment of hesitation, I picked it up. I knew the passcode, his mother's birthday, and typed it in with trembling fingers. Scrolling through his messages, I found nothing suspicious at first. Typical work reminders, messages from his sister about visiting their parents, a few sports updates from a friend. But then I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. Several deleted message threads. The phone showed gaps in the conversation list, as if entire chats had been wiped clean. Daniel wasn't the type to keep a pristine inbox, so why were these missing? I didn't know what had been said, who he'd spoken to, or why he'd feel the need to erase those exchanges. It might have been harmless, maybe just old messages he didn't need, but it felt too neat, too deliberate. I put the phone back exactly as I'd found it and retreated to the bedroom, my mind racing. If Daniel was hiding something, I needed more proof. But part of me wanted to believe he wasn't. Maybe I was the one overreacting. Maybe Tanya, or whoever sent that warning, was trying to tear us apart for reasons I couldn't yet see. A few days later, I tried another approach. I invited Tanya over for lunch. She seemed surprised but agreed. I prepared a simple meal, sandwiches, fruit, and iced tea, trying to create a relaxed atmosphere. When she arrived, I welcomed her warmly, and we chatted about old memories. Her eyes wandered around the living room, pausing at photos of Daniel and me, but she said nothing about him. We spoke about work, mutual acquaintances, the local news. She smiled the whole time, but there was a tension behind her gaze I'd never noticed before. About halfway through our lunch, I decided to press a little. I asked her casually, "Do you remember when I first introduced you to Daniel? You never seemed too fond of him." Her smile faltered for a second, just a flicker before she shrugged and said, "I guess we never really clicked. But I'm glad you're happy with him." I wanted to ask more, but I could feel her shutting down, retreating behind her polite demeanor. If she was the one who sent the message, she was determined not to show it. After Tanya left, I stood at the window, watching her walk to her car. Something about her posture seemed off. Her shoulders were tense, her steps quick. It made me think of prey trying not to draw attention to itself. I wondered if she regretted sending me that message, if she feared what might happen now that I was aware. Or maybe she wanted me to squirm, to suspect Daniel until I made a mistake that revealed his secrets. That night, as Daniel and I prepared dinner together, I dropped a casual hint. "Tanya came by today," I said, slicing tomatoes and avoiding his eyes. He nodded, asking how she was. He seemed unbothered, even curious. "She's good," I responded. "She asked about you." He didn't flinch, didn't show any sign of discomfort. Instead, he leaned over, kissed my forehead, and thanked me for making dinner. My chest tightened again, his gentleness felt real, but maybe that was the point. Maybe he had perfected the art of keeping me off balance. As the days passed, I dug deeper in quiet ways. I checked old emails, old social media messages, looking for any odd connection between Tanya and Daniel. Most things were innocent. A few polite exchanges after our wedding, a group chat we'd all been part of years ago. Nothing jumped out at me. Still, the feeling lingered that something was missing, hidden between the lines. Tanya wouldn't have risked sending that warning without reason. She must have known it would hurt me, and if she was truly my friend, she would have chosen honesty over mystery. Unless, of course, honesty would incriminate her in some way. I started noticing small changes in Daniel. He'd come home a bit later some evenings, with vague explanations about work. He seemed distracted sometimes, hesitating before answering simple questions. When I mentioned plans for the weekend, he'd blink a few times as if snapping out of a daydream. None of these things were damning on their own, but together they formed a pattern. He was hiding something, and he knew I was watching him more closely. In the quiet moments before sleep, I'd lie awake, wondering what lay beneath the surface of our marriage. I would think about Tanya's message again, the careful phrasing that suggested both concern and foreknowledge. "For your own sake, be careful." The words weren't a casual warning. They were a threat wrapped in advice. And yet, without more information, I couldn't decide who posed the bigger threat, my husband or the friend who claimed to protect me. I was caught in a silent battle of wills, trying to uncover the truth without tipping my hand. Every time I looked at Daniel, I scanned his face for clues, waiting for some crack in his perfect image. Every time I thought of Tanya, I wondered what kind of truth she guarded so tightly. The next step, I realized, would be to push harder, to corner one of them into revealing something. But I had to choose carefully. If I confronted Daniel with nothing but an anonymous text and a gut feeling, I might lose his trust and still learn nothing. If I pressed Tanya too much, she might vanish entirely, leaving me with no leads. My pulse quickened as I considered my options. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a dark forest, knowing I had to enter, but not sure what waited inside. I decided to stop waiting for answers to fall into my lap. One afternoon, when Daniel claimed he had to stay late at work, I made up my mind to follow him. It felt wrong, like I was stepping over a line, but I couldn't ignore the doubts gnawing at me. I drove downtown and parked a discreet distance from the office building he'd mentioned. I watched the entrance, expecting to see him emerge alone, maybe heading for dinner or running errands. Instead, after a few tense minutes, I spotted him stepping out with a familiar figure beside him, Tanya. They walked closely, but not hand in hand. She wore a neutral expression, and he looked calm, as if they were discussing ordinary matters. My chest tightened as I watched them navigate through the crowd. I followed on foot, keeping several people between us. I was careful, sticking to the shadows of shop windows and moving behind couples, hoping not to be seen. They led me along a quiet side street until they stopped at a small cafe's back entrance. There, away from curious eyes, Daniel leaned in, touching Tanya's arm, whispering something that made her smile sadly. That single moment, the way they stood together, the way he looked at her, told me everything I needed to know. This was no random meeting. It was quiet, practiced, and too intimate for old friends. My mind raced, recalling every strange detail I'd tried to piece together. Now the puzzle fit. Tanya's warning, her avoidance, the odd tension. She must have sent that message hoping to stir up trouble, to drive a wedge between Daniel and me, or to get me to uncover something on my own. Maybe she wanted me to react, forcing Daniel to make a choice. Whatever her intentions, I was seeing their secret with my own eyes. He had lied to me, and she had acted like a concerned friend while holding back the truth. Both of them had engineered this painful charade. I stood there trembling, gripping my phone so hard my knuckles turned white. I snapped a photo, shaky and blurred, but enough to remind me that I wasn't imagining this. My heart pounded against my ribs, and I had to swallow hard to keep steady. They lingered a few minutes more, talking in hushed tones. I could see Tanya's face in partial profile as she spoke. She looked worried, her brow furrowed. Was she telling him about the message she'd sent me? Was she trying to control how I might react if I found out? The sting of betrayal coursed through my veins, mixing anger and sadness into a poisonous brew. I wanted to march right up to them, to demand answers, to scream that I deserved honesty. But I knew that would only give them a chance to lie again, to twist the story. Instead, I waited until they stepped inside the cafe. Then I circled around to the front, took a seat by the window, and pretended to browse a menu. Through the glass, I glimpsed them at a corner table, heads bent together, hands resting close. If anyone saw them, they might think it was a private conversation, maybe a professional meeting. But I knew better now. They were too familiar, too connected by something I'd never been told about. I tried to recall if there had been signs I'd missed. Maybe subtle shifts in Daniel's mood, casual mentions of Tanya's name, odd moments when Tanya avoided me at gatherings. It all felt so obvious in hindsight. Yet I'd trusted them both, assuming that any coolness between them was just a personality clash. I never imagined they might share something deeper, darker. After a while, Tanya stood up, smoothing her blouse, as if preparing to leave. Daniel reached out and gently touched her hand. She paused, gazing at him for a long second before pulling away and heading for the door. I ducked behind my menu, heart hammering as she passed within inches of me. Then Daniel stepped out, scanning the street. I turned slightly, lowering my head, hoping the brim of my hat and the dim light would hide me. He seemed distracted, lost in thought, before walking off alone. I waited until he was gone, then rushed to my car, tears already burning in my eyes. I felt foolish and wounded, as if the foundation of my life had cracked beneath my feet. Tanya's message had been half-truth, half-manipulation. She had warned me about Daniel, but not from a place of pure friendship or concern. It was more like she'd nudged me toward a secret I was never supposed to find out, giving herself cover. Maybe she had grown tired of being hidden, of playing the other woman, and hoped that by tipping me off, she could push Daniel to leave me, or me to leave him. I sat in the driver's seat, staring at the busy street ahead, watching strangers hurry by. I wanted to hate them both, to feel pure rage. But all I felt was hollow confusion. I remembered Daniel's kindness, his early morning coffees, his gentle laughter. Were these acts all lies, or had something twisted along the way? And Tanya, my old friend, what had led her to this place? I couldn't comprehend how she could look me in the eye, knowing what she was doing behind my back. I knew I couldn't keep silent. The truth, no matter how painful, demanded confrontation. It was time to speak without hints or subtle tests. My marriage, my friendships, everything I'd held dear was now under a harsh light. I would have to ask the hard questions, even if it shattered the life I thought I knew. I drove home numb, barely noticing the streets I passed or the brightness of the setting sun. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my hands were shaking. I went straight inside, closing the door quietly behind me, and leaned against it for support. My heart hammered as I tried to decide on my next move. Confronting them was inevitable, but I needed some kind of advantage. Without it, I'd be at the mercy of their lies. Later that evening, Daniel came home like nothing had happened. He offered a soft smile, asking about my day. I forced a polite response, my voice steady, though each word felt like a shard of glass pressed against my tongue. He mentioned he'd been swamped at work, running late due to an unexpected meeting. I nodded, careful not to break the fragile surface of our routine. As he moved around the kitchen, opening cupboards, fetching plates, I studied him closely, waiting for any slip in his manner. But he was smooth as ever, gracious, attentive, perfectly composed. I spent the rest of the evening locked in my thoughts, feigning exhaustion to avoid conversation. I considered texting Tanya again, this time more directly. Maybe I could lure her into admitting something. But if she'd been bold enough to meet Daniel openly in public, she might be equally bold in her silence. Another idea nagged at me. If Tanya sent that initial warning, maybe there were more messages hidden somewhere. Perhaps she had tried other ways of reaching me before. I dug through old emails, scrolled back through social media messages, even checked my spam folder. That's where I found it, an email sent weeks ago, buried under a flood of junk mail. The sender's address was a random string of letters, but I recognized the writing style right away. I know what he's up to. You deserve better. Don't ignore the signs. Why send me cryptic hints in secret and then meet him so casually out in the open? The contradiction gnawed at me. Was she trying to provoke a confrontation? Maybe Tanya wanted me to catch them. Maybe she was tired of being second best, forcing my hand to either claim Daniel fully or walk away, leaving him free. This thought made my skin crawl. The woman who'd once been a friend was now playing puppet master with my life. The next day, I took off work and waited until Daniel left. Then I drove to Tanya's apartment building, parking at the far end of the lot. I couldn't just march to her door and demand answers. She might slam it in my face. So I watched, feeling like a spy in my own story, as people came and went. Finally, around midday, Tanya emerged, dressed smartly, her posture tense. She headed for her car. I started mine and followed at a distance, lungs tight with anticipation. She drove across town to a quiet residential neighborhood. I nearly lost her twice, but managed to keep up, staying a few cars behind. Eventually, she pulled into the driveway of a quaint little home with a blue door. I parked on a side street, hurrying on foot to catch a better glimpse. As I peered around a hedge, I watched her knock on the door. A moment later, it swung open. Standing there was another woman, older, with tired eyes and a guarded expression. Tanya stepped inside and the door closed. I retreated, heart pounding, confused by this new development. Who was this stranger? Was Tanya seeking advice, confessing something, or plotting her next move? My curiosity burned. I waited nearly an hour, concealed behind the hedge, until Tanya stepped out again. She looked as if she'd been crying, wiping her eyes briskly before getting back into her car. As she drove away, I noted the address and decided I would return later. Perhaps this older woman knew something about Tanya's motives. That evening, back at home, I confronted Daniel. I couldn't wait any longer. Standing in our living room, I told him I knew he'd been lying. His face changed instantly, a flicker of alarm beneath a carefully composed mask. He tried to deny it, claiming confusion, but I cut him off. I mentioned the cafe, his late nights, the disappearing messages. I watched him pale, struggling for the right words. Finally, he admitted he'd met Tanya, but insisted it wasn't what I thought. He spoke quickly, saying Tanya was troubled, that she'd reached out to him because she was going through a rough time. He said he'd wanted to keep it secret, so I wouldn't worry. The story sounded thin, and he knew it. I kept pressing. Then why the anonymous warning? Why the strange tension every time she's around? He clenched his jaw, running a hand through his hair. He admitted Tanya had feelings for him that went beyond friendship, that she'd been persistent and dramatic. He claimed he never encouraged it, but I saw a flicker of guilt in his eyes. He begged me to believe that he'd done nothing more than try to comfort an old friend who was unstable and jealous of our marriage. Part of me wanted to believe him, to cling to the idea that Tanya was the true villain. But I'd seen them together, watched how comfortable they were. Tanya wasn't the only one invested. I mentioned the older woman's house, said I knew Tanya had another ally in all of this. Daniel's face twisted into confusion. He clearly didn't know about that part. His inability to offer an explanation gave me a spark of confidence. They were hiding more than I realized, each with their own secrets. I had only scratched the surface. That night, while Daniel slept fitfully, I slipped out of bed and grabbed my keys. I drove back to that quiet neighborhood, parking under a dim streetlight. My heart pounded as I approached the blue-doored house. I had no plan for what I'd say, but I needed answers. I knocked softly, and after a few moments, the older woman answered, looking puzzled to see me. I introduced myself with a trembling voice, explaining only that I was a friend of Tanya's. Her eyes narrowed. After a long pause, she let me in, guiding me to a small living room that smelled of lavender and old books. I expected denial, but instead, the woman sighed and offered me tea. She said Tanya had been here earlier, tormented by guilt. She wouldn't reveal every detail, but I learned enough. Tanya and Daniel's relationship had deeper roots than I knew. There was history stretching back before my marriage, old promises made and broken. Tanya had stepped forward to warn me because she felt trapped, angry at being shoved into the shadows. She wanted me to discover the truth on my own, forcing Daniel's hand. But there was another layer. Tanya had her own secret, something that would rock the fragile understanding I was beginning to form. I pressed the older woman for more, but she shook her head, refusing to betray Tanya's confidence. She only said this, "You think you know what's happening, but you're seeing only half the picture. Tanya risked a lot to send you that message. She thought she was protecting herself, but now she's set a fire none of you can contain." My stomach nodded. If this was only half the picture, what was the other half? What else were they hiding? I left the house with more questions than answers. As I drove home under the moonlit sky, I realized the real confrontation lay ahead. Tanya and Daniel had woven a secret so tangled that I'd need to rip it apart piece by piece. The affair was just the beginning of a twisted story they'd guarded for years. Now that I'd stepped into the darkness, I had no choice but to follow it to the end, no matter what it revealed. I had no choice but to confront them both. I arranged a meeting, insisting Tanya come over while Daniel was home. At first, both resisted. Daniel claimed he was too busy. Tanya said she felt uncomfortable, but I held firm. They had played with my life, so they would face me together. On a late afternoon, the three of us stood in my living room, the air thick with unspoken truths. Tanya stood near the window, arms folded tightly as if to shield herself. Daniel hovered by the doorway, his face a mask of practiced calm. I sat down on the couch, my heart pounding, waiting for someone to speak. "I know about your meetings," I said quietly, eyes locked on Daniel. "And I know you warned me," I said, turning to Tanya. She flinched, glancing at Daniel as if seeking silent permission. No one answered. The silence grew painful, so I continued. "I found your messages, Tanya. The anonymous ones. I followed you both. I saw the way you looked at each other." Daniel swallowed, stepping forward, voice low. "It's complicated," he began. His words felt like old fabric worn thin with excuses. Tanya let out a strained laugh, shaking her head. "Complicated," she repeated. "Is that what you call it?" I stood up, unable to sit still any longer. "I met the older woman you visited," I said to Tanya. Her eyes widened. She hadn't expected that. "She wouldn't tell me everything, but I know there's more to this than a simple affair. You set this all in motion." "Why?" Tanya's composure cracked. Her voice trembled, raw with frustration. "Because he promised me things," she said, glaring at Daniel. "Before he ever met you, he and I had plans, dreams of a life together. But when his circumstances changed, he left me behind. He married you for stability, for appearances, while keeping me in the shadows." She ran a hand through her hair, tears threatening to spill. I tried to let it go, but he kept me close enough to hurt. "He said he couldn't leave you, not yet. He needed time," he said. But years passed, and I realized I'd become just a secret he fed with false hope. My knees weakened. Tanya's pain, though furious and twisted, felt genuine. "Why warn me, then?" I asked softly. "Why not just tell me everything face to face?" Tanya pressed her lips together, struggling to find the right words. "Because I didn't want to risk losing him if he actually chose me. I wanted you to discover his deception on your own, to watch you drift apart, forcing him to confront what he truly wanted. I thought that if you saw him for who he was, you'd leave, and I could finally have him completely." Her voice cracked. But when I met him that night at the cafe, he showed no sign of changing. He insisted he cared about us both, that he needed more time. I realized then he was never going to choose me. He would keep us both off balance forever. I turned to Daniel, who now looked gray with shock. "Is that true?" I demanded. "Did you feed her lies all these years?" He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "I loved you," he said weakly, gesturing to me. "I still do. But I never stopped caring about Tanya. We had something special before we married." He paused, voice lowering. "I was reckless. And then everything got tangled. I wanted security, respectability, but I couldn't let go of Tanya. She was always there, reminding me of who I'd been before. I told her what she wanted to hear, and told you what I thought you needed. And somewhere along the way, I lost control." My stomach twisted with disgust. "So, I was just a piece in your game," I said, voice shaking. "You married me while stringing Tanya along, keeping her hopes alive, feeding mine with false security." Tears gathered in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I wouldn't cry in front of these people who had turned my life upside down. Tanya stepped forward, voice clearer now. "There's more," she said. Daniel's head snapped around, panic in his eyes. She ignored him. "You deserve to know that he and we had a child." The room fell into stunned silence. My heart froze. "He never told you," Tanya continued, her tone bitter. "Years ago, we had a daughter. I left her in the care of the older woman you met, my aunt, when I realized Daniel wouldn't claim us openly. He paid for the child's care but always kept her a secret. I thought he'd come around, that one day he'd bring her into his life properly. But he never did." My chest ached. Daniel had hidden a child from me, a living, breathing part of himself concealed to protect his double life. He staggered back, eyes wide, as if he'd been struck. "I was afraid," he gasped. "Afraid you'd leave if you knew I had a child outside our marriage. Afraid of losing my reputation, the life we built. I told Tanya I needed time. I always needed more time. I felt something inside me break. The man I thought I knew stood before me with 1,000 lies dripping from his lips." I wanted to scream, but my voice emerged calm and steady. "Enough," I said, lifting a hand. "I don't want more excuses. You've both stolen pieces of my life, my trust, my peace, my dignity." I turned to Tanya, meeting her tear-filled gaze. "You used me too. Maybe you were a victim once, but you became complicit. You sent those messages and watched me unravel. You tried to orchestrate your own happy ending without caring about who you hurt." She hung her head, silent. Daniel tried to reach for me, but I stepped away. The gravity of his betrayal weighed on my heart like a stone. "This ends now," I said, voice firm. "I'm leaving you, Daniel. I refuse to live a lie, to share my life with someone who juggles secrets and women like toys. And Tanya, I don't want her apologies. You both made your choices." They stared at me, stunned and speechless. For the first time in weeks, I felt something like clarity. My life wouldn't be the same. My trust had been shattered, my marriage ruined. But at least now I knew the truth. I wouldn't spend another moment trapped in their web of deceit. I walked out into the evening air, tears finally spilling down my cheeks. Yet those tears didn't taste of defeat. They tasted like release. I would rebuild my life, piece by piece, without their lies weighing me down. Behind me, a broken silence stretched between them, a silence filled with regret and shame. I left them to sort through the wreckage they'd created. As I drove away, I promised myself something. I would learn from this, become stronger, and never again ignore the quiet warnings in my gut. I'd carry these scars, but they would not define me. In the end, the truth, however ugly, had set me free.